Good morning. It's Wednesday. I'm going to read the recent segment, and it's a good one. I like this one a lot. Like I said, I've been pre-reading so I can define terms for the viewer. But it's a good one. This one's one of my favorites so far. Let's see. Now, where did I leave off? Did I read this already? Sorry, I should be already okay, that's the one I read last time. Oh, that's the one I recorded last time. And then I think the pattern of psychic growth is uploading right now, which means the first approach of the unconscious. Come on. The first approach of the unconscious. This is a good one. Let me get my little book ready. I got so many journals going on. I have my regular journal. I have my dream journal. And I have my sacred contracts journal. I also have an astrology journal and a tarot journal. Okay. Let's see here. I'm just going to scoot this a little closer. Oh, mother effer. There goes all my change. So funny. Okay, fat boy, stop. Let me pick these coins up. And there's all my change. Taking the dogs to get bathed today. They have fleas. And I'm bombing the trailer. Flea bombing the trailer. I have a busy day. Okay. Oops. Let's get started. Just finished picking coins out of my booty. I'm laying coins. Like the golden duck. The duck with the golden eggs. Only I'm dropping pennies and quarters. Okay. Enough of the craziness, Sarah. You know what? To lose viewers once they find out you're really a nut job. Okay, you know what? Crazy dog. He chewed up one of my favorite slippers today. I have these little slip-on Adidas slippers. I usually slip them on when I take them outside to go potty late at night. And he chewed one of them up today. I'm so mad at you. Very mad. Upset with you, mister. Okay, I need to read. I know you love. Okay, I need to read. What are you gonna do? Stop. Can I start my book now, please? Do I have your permission, fat boy? Fucking crazy dog. The first approach of the unconscious. For most people, the years of youth are characterized by a state of gradual awakening in which the individual slowly becomes aware of the world and of himself. Childhood is a period of great emotional intensity, and a child's earliest dreams often manifest in symbolic form the basic structure of the psyche, indicating how it will later shape the destiny of the individual concerned. For example, Jung once told a group of students about a young woman who was so haunted by anxiety that she committed suicide at the age of 26. As a small child, she had dreamed that Jack Frost had entered her room while she was lying in bed and pinched her on the stomach. She woke and discovered that she had pinched herself with her own hand. The dream did not frighten her. She merely remembered that she had had such a dream. But the fact that she did not react emotionally to her strange encounter with the demon of the cold of congealed life did not agor. So this is a word I didn't know. Hold on. I need for you to give me some space. God. Here it is. It's pronounced oger. In ancient Rome, any of a body of officials who interpreted omens as being favorable or unfavorable in connection with an undertaking, a fortune teller, prophet, or soothsayer, to foretell or prophecy from omens or to be an actual omen. And it's oger, my bad, oger. So let's see here. Did not augur well for the future and was itself abnormal. It was with a cold, unfeeling hand that she later put an end to her life. From the single dream, it is possible to deduce the tragic fate of the dreamer, which was anticipated by her psyche in the childhood. Sometimes it is not a dream, but some very impressive and unforgettable real event that, like a prophecy, anticipates the future in symbolic form. Oh, God, that's happened to me my whole entire life and continues. So it's so important for me. That's one reason I'm choosing to not drink or do drugs or anything. I mean, I don't have anything against anybody who, I mean, I don't know why I'm even talking about this, like an occasional drink every once in a while. I'm not even doing that, or smoking any marijuana or anything, because I want to be totally aware of my surroundings and my life and what's happening, because looking back on my life, so many things, so many events were foreshadowing of what was to come in the future, and I just didn't pay attention. Not that I could precisely tell what was going to happen, but like, for example, when my son turned 18, I had a huge birthday party for him. I invited people from his past. Everyone was there. Everyone was there. And then by the time he was 22, he was dead. It's like, it was just like a little foreshadowing, like a huge freaking party for him when he turned 18, not knowing that he would be dead by the age of 22. Just little stuff like that has happened for a lot of my life. The dream did not, okay, so sometimes it is not a dream, but some very impressive and unforgettable real event that, like a prophecy, anticipates the future in symbolic form. It is well known that children often forget events that seem impressive to adults, but keep a vivid recollection of some incident or story that no one else has noticed. When we look into one of these childhood memories, we usually find that it depicts, if interpreted as if it were a symbol, a basic problem of the child's psychic makeup. When a child reaches school age, the phase of building up the ego and of adapting to the outer world begins. This phase generally brings a number of painful shocks. At the same time, some children begin to feel very different from others, and this feeling of being unique brings a certain sadness that is part of the loneliness of many youngsters. The imperfections of the world and the evil within oneself, as well as outside, becomes conscious problems. The child must try to cope with urgent, but not yet understood, inner impulses, as well as the demands of the outer world. If the development of the consciousness is disturbed in its normal unfolding, children frequently retire from outer or inner difficulties into an inner fortress. And when that happens, Their dreams and symbolic drawings of unconscious material often reveal, to an unusual degree, a type of circular, quadrangular, and nuclear motif, which I will explain later. This refers to the previously mentioned psychic nucleus, the vital center of the personality from which the whole structural development of consciousness stems. It is natural that the image of the center should appear in a specially striking way when the psychic life of the individual is threatened. From this central nucleus, as far as we know today, the whole building up of ego consciousness is directed, the ego apparently being a duplicate or structural counterpart of the original center. In this early phase, there are many children who earnestly seek for some meaning in life that could help them to deal with the chaos both within and outside themselves. There are others, however, who are still unconsciously carried along by the dynamism of inherited and instinctive archetypical patterns. These young people are not concerned about the deeper meaning of life because their experiences with love, nature, sport, and work contain an immediate and satisfying meaning for them. They are not necessarily more superficial. Usually they are carried by the stream of life with less friction and disturbance than their more introspective fellows. If I travel in a car or train without looking out, it is only the stops, starts, and sudden turns that make me realize I am moving at all. It's a pretty profound paragraph right there. The actual process of individuation, the conscious coming to terms with one's own inner center, psychic nucleus. So it's like, children who grow up in affluent and loving homes and don't have a lot of conflict to deal with at an early age, don't have the opportunity to go within and ask, what is the meaning of this? What am I doing here? What is this about? And those of us who grew up in conflict and poverty and drug addiction and sexual abuse and neglect, and all those wonderful little juicy tidbits that make us go into introspection. We start from an early age asking, what the fuck is this about? That's why a lot of people, I think, and I'm stereotyping here because I've never been from a family of affluence, so if someone's listening who is from affluence and can enlighten me, that'd be great. But in my experience, people of affluence just keep on getting away with shitty behavior, criminal behavior, just fucking people over, and they never look at it as like, oh wow, what am I doing? Because they're never given an opportunity to look at what they're doing as moralistically wrong, because no one ever calls them out on their bullshit. Because unfortunately, the fact of the matter is, money can pay your way out of a lot of trouble. I've met I grew up in a really affluent county, although I wasn't affluent. And let me tell you, there are some individuals I grew up with who are spoiled and their parents have bought them out of their troubles time and time again. Sometimes it is, okay, let's see here. If the development of consciousness is disturbed by its normal unfolding, okay, I read that part. Let's see. The actual process of individuation, the conscious coming to terms with one's own inner center, psychic nucleus, or self, generally begins with a wounding of the personality and the suffering that accompanies it. This initial shock amounts to a sort of call, although it is not often recognized as such. On the contrary, the ego feels hampered in its will or its desire, and usually projects the obstruction onto something external. That is, the ego accuses God or the economic situation, or the boss or the marriage partner, of being responsible for whatever is obstructing it. Or perhaps everything seems outwardly all right, but beneath the surface a person is suffering from a deadly boredom that makes everything seem meaningless and empty. Many myths and fairy tales symbolically describe this initial stage in the process of individuation by telling of a king who has fallen ill or grown old. Other familiar story patterns are that a royal couple is barren, or that a monster steals all the women, children, horses, and wealth of the kingdom, or that a demon keeps the king's army or his ship from proceeding on its course, or that darkness hangs over the lands, wells dry up, and flood and drought and frost afflict the country. Thus it seems as if the initial encounter with the self casts a dark shadow ahead of time, or as if the inner friend comes at first like a trapper to catch the helplessly struggling ego in his snare. In myths, one finds that the magic or talisman that can cure the misfortune of the king or his country always proves to be something very special. In one tale, a white blackbird, or a fish that carries a golden ring in its gills, is needed to restore the king's health. In another, the king wants the water of life, or 3 golden hairs from the head of the devil, or a woman's golden plate, and afterward, naturally, the owner of the plate. Whatever it is, the thing that can drive away the evil is always unique and hard to find. It is exactly the same in the initial crisis in the life of an individual. One is seeking something that is impossible to find, or about which nothing is known. In such moments, all well-meant, sensible advice is completely useless. Advice that urges one to try to be responsible, to take a holiday, not to work so hard, or to work harder, to have more or less human contact, or to take up a hobby. None of that helps, or at best, only rarely. There is only one thing that seems to work, and that is to turn directly toward the approaching darkness, without prejudice and totally naively, and try to find out what its secret aim is and what it wants from you. The hidden purpose of the oncoming darkness is generally something so unusual, so unique and unexpected, that as a rule, one can find out what it is only by means of dreams and fantasies welling up from the unconscious. If one focuses attention on the unconscious with rash assumptions or emotional rejection, it often breaks through in a flow of helpful symbolic images, but not always. Sometimes it first offers a series of painful realizations of what is wrong with oneself and one's conscious attitudes. Then one must begin the process by swallowing all sorts of bitter truths. The realization of the shadow. Whether the unconscious comes up at first in a helpful or negative form, after a time the need usually arises to readapt the conscious attitude in a better way to the unconscious factors. Therefore, to accept what seems to be criticism from the unconscious. Through dreams, one becomes acquainted with the aspect of one's own personality that for various reasons one has preferred not to look at too closely. This is what Jung called the realization of the shadow. He used the term shadow for the unconscious part of the personality because it actually often appears in dreams in a personified form. This is a picture of a woodcut from the 17th century alchemical manuscript. Depicts a king who has fallen ill, a common symbolic image of the emptiness and boredom in the consciousness that can mark the individual stage of the individuation process. I know you need attention. The shadow is not the whole of the unconscious personality. It represents unknown or little known attributes and qualities of the ego, aspects that mostly belong to the personal sphere and that could just as well be conscious. In some aspects, the shadow can also consist of collective factors that stem from a source outside the individual's personal life. When an individual makes an attempt to see his shadow, and here's some examples, 3 examples of a collective infection that can weld people into an irrational mob, to which the shadow, the dark side of the ego personality, is vulnerable. Top left is seen from a 1961 Polish film concerning 17th century French nuns who were possessed by the devil. Lower left, a drawing by Bruegel depicts the affliction, largely psychosomatic, called St. Vitus dance, which was widespread in the Middle Ages. Above, the fiery cross emblem of the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacy secret society of America's South, whose radical intolerance has often led to acts of mob violence. So we left off with mid-sentence. When an individual makes an attempt to see his shadow, he becomes aware of and often ashamed of those qualities of impulses he denies in himself, but can plainly see in other people. Such things as egotism, mental laziness and sloppiness, unreal fantasies, schemes and plots, carelessness and cowardice, inordinate love of money and possessions. In short, all the little sins about which he might previously have told himself, "This doesn't matter, nobody will notice it, and in any case, other people do it too." If you feel an overwhelming rage coming up in you when a friend reproaches you about a fault, you can be fairly sure that at this point you will find a part of your shadow, of which you are unconscious. It is, of course, natural to become annoyed when others who are no better criticize you because of shadow faults. But what can you say if your own dreams, an inner judge of your own being, reproach you? That is the moment when the ego gets caught, and the result is usually embarrassed silence. Afterward, the painful and lengthy work of self-education begins. A work, we might say, that is the psychological equivalent of the labors of Hercules. This unfortunate hero's first task, you will remember, was to clean up the stables of Ogygian, in which hundreds of cattle had dropped their dung for many decades. A task so enormous that the ordinary mortal would be overcome by discouragement at the mere thought of it. The shadow does not consist of only omissions. It shows up just as often as an impulsive or inadvertent act. Before one has time to think, the evil remark pops out. The plot is hatched. The wrong decision is made. And one is confronted with the results that were never intended or consciously wanted. When a man is alone, for instance, he feels relatively all right. But as soon as the others do dark, primitive things, he begins to fear that if he doesn't join in, he will be considered a fool. Thus, he gives way to impulses that do not really belong to him at all. It is particularly in contacts with people of the same sex that one stumbles over both one's shadow and those of other people. Although we do see the shadow in persons of the opposite sex, we are usually much less annoyed by it and can more easily pardon it. In dreams and myths, therefore, the shadow appears as a person of the same sex as that of the dreamer. The following dream may serve as an example. The dreamer was a man of 48 who tried to live very much for and by himself, working hard and disciplining himself, repressing pleasure and spontaneity to a far greater extent than suited his real nature. I owned and inhabited a very big house in town, and I didn't yet know all of its different parts. So I took a walk through it and discovered, mainly in the cellar, several rooms about which I knew nothing, and even exits leading into other cellars or into subterranean streets. I felt uneasy when I found that several of these exits were not locked, and some had no locks at all. And moreover, there were some laborers at work in the neighborhood who could have sneaked in. When I came up against to the ground floor, I passed a backyard where I discovered different exits into the street or into other houses. When I tried to investigate them more closely, a man came up to me laughing loudly and calling out that we were old pals from the elementary school. I remembered him too, and while he was telling me about his life, I walked along with him and toward the exit and strolled with him through the streets. There was a strange, this is a word I wrote down, chiaroscuro. I think I'm pronouncing it right. There was a strange chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro. The treatment of light and shade in a painting to produce the illusion of depth, dramatic effect. There was a strange chiaroscuro in the air as we walked through an enormous circular street and arrived at a green lawn where 3 galloping horses suddenly passed us. They were beautiful, strong animals, wild but well-groomed, and they had no rider with them. Had they run away from the military service? The maze of strange passages, chambers, and unlocked exits in the cellar recalls the old Egyptian representation of the underworld, which is a well-known symbol of the unconscious with its unknown possibilities. It also shows how one is open to other influences in one's unconscious shadow side, and how uncanny and alien elements can break in. The cellar, one can say, is the basement of the dreamer's psyche. In the backyard of the strange building, which represents the still unperceived psychic scope of the dreamer's personality, an old school friend suddenly turns up. This person obviously personifies another aspect of the dreamer himself, an aspect that had been part of his life as a child, but that he had forgotten and lost. It often happens that a person's childhood qualities, for instance, gaiety, irascibility, which means easily angered, quickly tempered, gaiety, irascibility, or perhaps trustfulness suddenly disappear, and one does not know where or how they have gone. It is such a lost characteristic of the dreamer that now returns from the backyard and tries to make friends again. This figure probably stands for the dreamer's neglected capacity for enjoying life and for his extroverted shadow side. But we soon learn why the dreamer feels uneasy just before meeting this seemingly harmless old friend. When he strolls with him in the street, the horses break loose. The dreamer thinks they may have escaped from military service, that is to say, from the conscious discipline that has hitherto characterized his life. The fact that the horses have no rider shows that the instinctive drives can get away from conscious control. In this old friend and in the horses, all the positive force reappears that was lacking before and was badly needed by the dreamer. This is a problem that often comes up when one meets one's other side. The shadow usually contains values that are needed by consciousness, but that exist in a form that makes it difficult to integrate them into one's life. The passages in the large house in this dream also show that the dreamer does not yet know his own psychic dimensions and is not yet able to fill them out. The shadow in this dream is typical for an introvert, a man who tends to retire too much from outer life. In the case of an extrovert who is turned more toward outer objects and outer life, the shadow would look quite different. A young man who had a very lively temperament embarked again and again on successful enterprises, while at the same time his dreams insisted that he should finish off a piece of private creative work he had begun. The following was one of those dreams, and there's a picture here. The unconscious is often symbolized by corridors, labyrinths, or mazes. Right, drawings of 3 mazes, top to bottom, a finished stone maze, Bronze Age, a 19th century British turf maze, and a maze in tiles on the floor of the Chartres Cathedral. It could be walked as a symbolic pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And it's interesting, I had a dream last night of mazes in a river. So mazes represent the unconscious. Interesting. My daughter was with me in the dream. A man is lying on a couch and has pulled the cover over his face. He is a Frenchman, a desperado who would take on any criminal job. An official is accompanying me downstairs, and I know that a plot has been made against me, namely that the Frenchman should kill me if by chance. That is how it would look from the outside. He actually sneaks up behind me when we approach the exit, but I am on my guard. A tall, portly man, rather rich and influential, suddenly leans against the wall beside me, feeling ill. I quickly grab the opportunity to kill the official by stabbing his heart. One only notices a bit of moisture. This is said like a comment. Now I am safe, for the Frenchman won't attack me since the man who gave him his orders is dead. Probably the official and the successful portly man are the same person, the latter somehow replacing the former. The desperado represents the other side of the dreamer, his introversion, which has reached a completely destitute state. He lies on a couch, he is passive, and pulls the cover over his face because he wants to be left alone. The official, on the other hand, and the prosperous portly man, who are secretly the same person, personify the dreamer's successful outer responsibilities and activities. The sudden illness of the portly man is connected with the fact that this dreamer had in fact become ill several times when he allowed his dynamic energy to explode too forcibly in his external life. But this successful man has no blood in his veins, only a sort of moisture, which means that these external ambitious activities of the dreamer contain no genuine life and no passion, but are bloodless mechanisms. Thus, it would be no real loss if the portly man were killed. At the end of the dream, the Frenchman is satisfied. He obviously represents a positive shadow figure who had turned negative and dangerous only because of the conscious attitude of the dreamer did not agree with him. This dream shows us that the shadow can consist of many different elements, for instance, of unconscious ambition, the successful portly man, and of introversion, the French man. This particular dreamer's association to the French, moreover, was that they know how to handle love affairs very well. Therefore, the two shadow figures also represent two well-known drives, power and sex. The power drive appears momentarily in a double form, both as an official and as a successful man. The official or civil servant personifies collective adaptation, whereas the successful man denotes ambition. But naturally, both serve the power drive. When the dreamer succeeds in stopping the dangerous inner force, the Frenchman is suddenly no longer hostile. In other words, the equally dangerous aspect of the sex drive has been surrendered. Obviously, the problem of the shadow plays a great role in all political conflicts. If the man who had this dream had not been sensible about his shadow problem, he could easily have identified the desperate Frenchman with the dangerous communists of outer life, or the official plus the prosperous man with the grasping capitalists. In this way, he would have avoided seeing that he had within him such warring elements. If people observe their own unconscious tendencies in other people, this is called projection. Political agitation in all countries is full of such projections, such as much as the backyard gossip of our little groups and individuals. Projections of all kinds obscure our view of our fellow men, spoiling its objectivity, and thus spoiling all possibility of genuine human relationships. And there is an additional disadvantage in projecting our shadow. If we identify our own shadow with, say, the communists or the capitalists, a part of our own personality remains on the opposing side. The result is that we shall constantly, though involuntarily, do things behind our own backs that support this other side. And thus we shall unwittingly help our enemy. If, on the contrary, we realize the projection and can discuss matters without fear or hostility, dealing with the other person sensibly, then there is a chance of mutual understanding, or at least of a truce. And then they show a picture of Hitler. For 5 years, this man has been chasing around Europe like a madman in search of something he could set on fire. Unfortunately, he again and again finds hirelings who open the gates of their country to this international incendiary. Rather than face our defects as revealed by the shadow, we project them onto others. For instance, onto our political enemies. Above, Hitler during a speech, the quotation is his description of Churchill. The quotation is his description of Churchill. Okay, so Hitler says about Churchill, for 5 years this man has been chasing around Europe like a madman in search of something he could set on fire. Unfortunately, he again and again finds hirelings who open the gates of their country to do this international incendiary. Interesting. That's Hitler's quote. Hitler during his speech, the quotation is his description of Churchill. Interesting. Whether the shadow becomes our friend or enemy depends largely upon ourselves. As the dreams of the unexplored houses and the French desperado both show, the shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, he is exactly like any human being with whom one has to get along, sometimes by giving in, sometimes by resisting, sometimes by giving love, whatever the situation requires. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood. Sometimes, though not often, an individual feels impelled to live out the worst side of his nature and to repress his better side. It's like my mom. It's so sad. In such cases, the shadow appears as a positive figure in his dreams, but to a person who lives out his natural emotions and feelings, the shadow may appear as a cold and negative intellectual. It then personifies poisonous judgments and negative thoughts that have been held back. So whatever form it takes, the function of the shadow is to represent the opposite side of the ego and to embody just those qualities that one dislikes. No! Don't do that! Stop! Fat boy, stop! Fat boy, stop. Don't do that. Giving me a heart attack. God, you shock me every time. You even barking at. Is to represent the opposite side of the ego and to embody, stop, just those qualities that one dislikes most in other people. It would be relatively easy if one could integrate the shadow into the conscious personality just by attempting to be honest and to use one's insight. But unfortunately, such an attempt does not always work. There is such a passionate drive within the shadowy part of oneself that reason may not prevail against it. A bitter experience coming from the outside may occasionally help. A brick, so to speak, has to drop on one's head to put a stop to shadow drives and impulses. At times, a heroic decision may serve to halt them, but such a superhuman effort is usually possible only if the great man within, the self, helps the individual to carry it through. The fact that the shadow contains the overwhelming power of irresistible impulse does not mean, however, that the drive should always be heroically repressed. Sometimes the shadow is powerful because the urge of the self is pointing in the same direction, and so one does not know whether it is the self or the shadow that is behind the inner pressure. In the unconscious, one is unfortunately in the same situation as in a moonlit landscape. All the contents are blurred and merge into one another, and one never knows exactly what or where anything is, or where one thing begins and ends. This is known as the contamination of unconscious contents. When Jung called one aspect of the unconscious personality the shadow, he was referring to a relatively well-defined factor. But sometimes everything that is unknown to the ego is mixed up with the shadow, including even the most valuable and highest forces. Who, for instance, could be quite sure whether the French desperado in the dream I quoted was a useless tramp or a most valuable introvert? And the bolting horses of the preceding dream, should they be allowed to run free or not? In a case when the dream itself does not make things clear, the conscious personality will have to make that decision. If the shadow figure contains valuable, vital forces, they ought to be assimilated into actual experience and not repressed. It is up to the ego to give up its pride and piggishness and to live out something that seems to be dark, but actually may not be. This can require a sacrifice just as heroic as the conquest of passion, but in an opposite sense. The ethical difficulties that arise when one meets one's shadow are well described in the 18th book of the Quran. In this tale, Moses meets Hidir, the green one, the first angel of God. Fat boy, stop! In the desert. They wander along together. And Hidir expresses his fear that Moses will not be able to witness his deeds without indignation, which is righteous justice. If Moses, righteous anger, that is what it is. If Moses cannot bear with him and trust him, Heder will have to leave. Presently, Heder skettles the fishing boats of some poor villagers. Then, before Moses' eyes, he kills a handsome young man, and finally he restores the fallen wall of a city of unbelievers. Moses cannot help expressing his indignation, and so Heder has to leave him. Before his departure, however, he explains his reasons for his actions. By scuttling the boat, he actually saved it for its owners because pirates were on their way to steal it. As it is, the fishermen can salvage it. The handsome young man was on his way to commit a crime, and by killing him, Heder saved his pious parents from infamy. By restoring the wall, two pious young men were saved from ruin because their treasure was buried under it. Moses, who had been so morally indignant, saw now, too late, that his judgment had been too hasty. Heder's doings had seemed to be totally evil, but in fact, they were not. Looking at this story naively, one might assume that Heder is the lawless, capricious, evil shadow of pious law-abiding Moses. But this is not the case. Heder is much more the personification of some secret creative actions of the Godhead. One can find a similar meaning in the famous Indian story of the king and the corpse, as interpreted by Henry Zemmer. It is no accident that I have not quoted a dream to illustrate this subtle problem. I have chosen this well-known story from the Quran because it sums up the experience of a lifetime, which would very rarely be expressed with such clarity as in an individual dream. When dark figures turn up in our dreams and seem to want something, we cannot be sure whether they personify merely a shadowy part of ourselves or the self, or both at the same time. Divining in advance whether our dark partner symbolizes a shortcoming that we should overcome or a meaningful bit of life that we should accept. This is one of the most difficult problems that we encounter on the way to individuation. Moreover, the dream symbols are often so subtle and complicated that one cannot be sure of their interpretation. In such a situation, all one can do is accept the discomfort of ethical doubt, making no final decisions or commitments and continuing to watch the dreams. This resembles the situation of Cinderella when her stepmother threw a heap of good and bad peas in front of her and asked her to sort them out, although it seemed quite hopeless. Cinderella began patiently to sort the peas, and suddenly doves, or ants in some versions, came to help her. These creatures symbolize helpful, deeply unconscious impulses that can only be felt in one's body, as it were, and that point to a way out. Somewhere, right at the bottom of one's own being, one generally does know where one should go and what one should do. But there are times when the clown we call I behaves in such a distracting fashion that the inner voice cannot make its presence felt. Sometimes all attempts to understand the hints of the unconscious fail, and in such a difficulty, one can only have the courage to do what seems to be right, while being ready to change course if the suggestions of the unconscious should so suddenly point in another direction. It may also happen, although this is unusual, that a person will find it better to resist the urge of the unconscious, even at the price of feeling warped by doing so, rather than depart too far from the state of being human. This would be the situation of people who have to live out a criminal disposition in order to be completely themselves. The strength of the inner clarity needed by the ego in order to make such a decision stems secretly from the great man, who apparently does not want to reveal himself too clearly. It may be that the self wants the ego to make a free choice, Or it may be that the self depends on a human consciousness and its decisions to help him become manifest. When it comes to such difficult ethical problems, no one can truly judge the deeds of the other. I love this. When it comes to such difficult ethical problems, no one can truly judge the deeds of others. Each man has to look at his own problem and try to determine what is right for himself. As an old Zen Buddhist master said, we must follow the example of the cowherd who watches his ox with a stick so that it will not graze on other people's meadows. I'm going to repeat that. This has been done in my life so much that it caused the death of my son and the removal of my daughter. Other people grazing on my meadow. Zen Buddhist master said, we must follow the examples of the cowherd who watches his ox with a stick so that he will not graze on other people's meadows. Sweep your own porch. Stop looking at mine. These new discoveries of depth psychology are bound to make some changes in our collective ethical views, for they will compel us to judge all human actions in much more individual and subtle ways. The discovery of the unconscious is one of the most far-reaching discoveries of recent times, but the fact that recognition of its unconscious reality involves honest self-examination and reorganization of one's life causes many people to continue to behave as if nothing has happened at all. It takes a lot of courage to take the unconscious seriously and to tackle the problems it raises. Most people are too indolent to think deeply about even those moral aspects of their behavior. And this brings me to the point that I brought up. It's like people of affluence, and I could be wrong because I've never been affluent, but like they never look at their moral decisions because they've never been forced to, because their money cushions their fall every time. Most people are too indolent to think deeply about even those moral aspects of their behavior, of which they are conscious, and they are certainly too lazy to consider how the unconscious affects them. Great chapter. I loved this chapter. So next time I record, I'll read The Anima, the Woman Within. Everyone have a great Wednesday. Check in with you soon.